Hey everybody, good day. It is October the 15th, kind of a time of the year that we often see a lot of volatility in the markets, and we're seeing a lot of global volatility in geopolitics as well. And today, for the first time on this channel, I've got my dear friend David Murrin, a close neighbour and somebody who we have a lot of very interesting conversations with. We think similarly and we think differently. So I thought this would be a great time to invite David. David, welcome to the Market Timing Report channel, and I'm really excited to ask you a whole bunch of questions. And I know this could go on for a while, so I think we'll end up splitting this into several different little videos that you can that the folks can digest. But welcome. Where do we start, David? I mean, look, there's so much to talk about. I think over the course of this session, perhaps we can look at the economic situation, the market situation, the geopolitical situation with all the major theaters. There's so much going on. I mean, okay, David, let's start off with something that everybody's interested in, which is the equity markets. Friday last week saw a very sharp sell-off, and then we've seen a bit of a recovery so far. Those timing points were given in the latest market timing report. The markets are at all-time highs, and yet there is so much geopolitical uncertainty. I think, put that together for us. Where do you see all this?
Well, I'm in agreement with you that we're at a major turning point right now, and Friday could well have been the high of the whole process. But how we got to this level is really interesting. So let's just look at the geopolitical position of America. It is in late stage decline, according to my Empire analysis. And during that period, you print money for a good reason because you've lost real productivity. So you compensate for the loss of productivity by financial leverage. And that process means you get less and less real productivity, but you end up with greater financialization and the money goes somewhere. It's like hot air. It goes into the marketplace and it's like these ping pong balls that are kept up by hot air. And what we've seen is a continual process of the hot air entering into the marketplace. Now, it hasn't done so in a healthy way because the assets that it's invested in have got narrower and narrower and narrower. So, the Magnificent Seven became the Magnificent Four that moved up and two don't, like Tesla dropped out. And so that process of narrowing, we saw that in cryptocurrencies, where essentially the only one making a new high was Bitcoin because of the liquidity depth, but the other ones were actually making corrective highs. So I think Bitcoin and the equity market are products of a liquidity bubble. But that bubble feels like it's blown. And once it blows, everything's going to implode. You're seeing a personal debt bubble. You're seeing, an AI bubble. There's like bubbles in all of these processes. They reflect the last throw of money printing to compensate for lack of real productivity in the American system. And the real arbiter to what's happened there is if in America is an internal system, they can keep playing that game until you get really like super leverage and fractional growth. But there is an external agent here, and that's China. And China has just proven by its rare earth strategy that China holds the choke collar to America. And that is a really big process. On Friday, the day after they announced these rare earth processes which prevent heavy rees from going into the defense industry of America, China has the choke collar on America. Trump is not the big dog. Trump doesn't have control over this. Not that he had control over a lot of things, but he thought he did. And when a system is challenged from outside like this, that is the catalyst that actually they can't fuel the bubble in the same way. So I think what happened last week was very critical as a turning point.
Okay, so with regards to China then, and with obviously the latest thing is the rare earths issue. Where are we with China and Taiwan, in your opinion?
So it goes back to the Taiwanese Straits crisis of 96, where they created a covert strategy to challenge and dominate the world. They suckered us into building a manufacturing base for them, which the liberals did and the people from Wall Street did because they were greedy and they made lots of money. But actually, it kept inflation low because manufacturing was cheap, and that meant they could print more money to compensate for less growth. So it was a really vicious circle which ate the West and it fed China. Then they moved with Xi from 2012 into a more overt strategy. Then they accelerated their arms race. They nailed us, I would argue, over the pandemic because we used our money to keep a poor pandemic strategy in our economies that were locked down, and we used debt to keep them alive instead of using it to reintegrate and expand our defense. And since then, they've been involved in a massive arms race, which has gone unanswered in the West. and they have basically become very overtly the center of the axis of autocracy. They're now providing full-on lethal aid to the Chinese. They support the Iranians, the North Koreans, the Pakistanis. They flipped Indonesia. Everywhere you look, their footprint is massively and quickly expanding. And I think all of this expansion, again, that's been ignored in the West, not talked about, not seen consistently, comes to a head at the parade that was only 2 weeks ago, when Xi's parade said, "We're here." And just before, the SCO members were basically suborned to be a second-tier group of the axis of autocracy. And now they're overtly making their challenge. It was not a coincidence, and Putin rushed home and said, "We're at war with NATO," because basically he was encouraged by Xi and given support. It's not a coincidence that we've got this rare earth like leverage point just afterwards. So I see them really ratcheting up the pressure, and at any stage, that pressure manifesting a kinetic attack on Taiwan. And so every exercise we see of fleets and aeroplanes around Taiwan has to be in what I would call an amber alert, because we can't tell the difference anymore, whether it's an exercise or the preparations for a real event. And I think once that happens, very quickly, the Chinese have a plan to go everywhere, all the way down to Australia, because they assume the Japanese come to support the Taiwanese, therefore the Americans. They're involved in a regional struggle. And the only way you win a regional struggle is by emulating what the Japanese didn't achieve, which is pushing America out all the way of New Zealand, Australia, all the way to Hawaii, where the tyranny of distance keeps them at bay.
And how soon do you think this is likely to unfold?
I think we're just in the imminent time. We're in it. You can't really tell. We know that China's economy is in big trouble, but that's not because they're weak, as many people say. That's because they've been militarizing their economy and they have a demand gap. And they've taken the price for militarization to be the demand gap by not relying on exports in the same way. That's very similar to the Nazi 4-year plan, where they were going to go bust in 1940, so they went to war in 1939. And I think that going bust point is anywhere from now to a year, or really having trouble. So I really think that they are on the edge of that point. And the only thing that's delayed their actions is that over the past few months, you hear about Xi getting rid of 1,400 PLAN officers. They were all senior officers. So there's been some rebellion or some lack of control that he's not been able to exert over the Chinese military structure, which may have slowed down his plans for expansion kinetically.
So, how will this spill over into Europe?
Well, it is already, because what you're seeing is Ukraine is a NATO war, whether we say or not, it is. And Russia is propped up and supported by China economically through the sale of its oil and gas and through the supply of its war material now, which has now become really quite direct. Intelligence sharing. It's the same basically with Iran crossing over in terms of the linkages. They're all interconnected. We are facing an alliance like the Axis in the First and Second World War, exactly the same thing. It's just people haven't cottoned on to the fact it has lethal intent. So in Europe, we would definitely be disabling the economy of Russia faster without China. And now you've got Russia coming back and saying we're at war with NATO and increasing the shadow conflict and pushing our boundaries. And unfortunately, we are not in a position where we will defend every inch, because we don't have the intention to defend every inch. So our responses have been lamentable and only encourage further aggression. So we're really a taker of this aggression, and we still haven't put them at risk. So I think the pattern of escalation is going to increase until there is an accident where literally the Russians go too far and we respond, and then it escalates. I don't think Russia can beat NATO. I think, on the contrary, if NATO went to war with it, its air power would dominate Russia and destroy its capabilities very quickly. But we don't have certain capabilities if the Chinese join the Russians. And I think that should be our biggest nightmare right now, because if you look at the Second World War in its specific context, it was not man intensive, it was machine and ship intensive when America took the Asian basin. And in reverse, the Chinese won't use a lot of their manpower, which frees it up to migrate and join the Russians on the border. So NATO shouldn't be comfortable in thinking it's going to be 5 years. It should be planning for war now, because that's the risk scenario. And if I look at the market setup, I can see this in many ways. I can see the stock market is asleep in the US, and it definitely is at a turning point that we've talked about. That turning point is very important because markets are quite good at preceding or anticipating events. And so the framework of a down market is at the early stages is an interesting one. I think the bond markets are probably the biggest economic bomb waiting to go off. After falling for 3 years, they've been going sideways for a year. And that sideways is just a consolidation before a downward push. And Britain is right at the weak stage of that process, and France with it. Although German yields are going to increase, the Germans have low debt to GDP ratios, so they're not going to have a debt crisis. They're just going to have increased price of their debt. Whereas Britain really could have a debt crisis, and America could have a debt crisis, which is one of my biggest concerns: is how do we sustain conflict or even deterrence in a super cold war against China when we don't have the backing of the debt markets to actually borrow and rearm? And how do you rearm when your re-earths are choked off? So we're in a slight checkmate in the West. We really are. And so that's why this idea that you can create multiplicity of weapon systems that are cheaper is so critical, because we can't do it using exquisite, expensive systems because we just don't have enough money.
So, a couple of things there with regards to Britain. I mean, do you think Britain has enough military capability to participate in anything? And also, I just want to add this point that you mentioned about a debt crisis for Britain. That was the latest topic I've been writing about. The 200-year cycle is coming in. 1825 really saw financial calamity in the United Kingdom, starting really late October, then November, and accelerating into December. And of course, we've got the budget coming in. But let's not digress from what we're talking about now. Maybe we'll talk about that in a minute, David. Do you think Britain has the suitable arms capability together with the rest of the NATO countries? I mean, is NATO underarmed right now, or do you think NATO can definitely take on such a confrontation?
Well, NATO with America and without America are two different things.
Yeah.
Even without America, we have great air power, especially with the F-35s, and the capability to destroy Russian air defenses and therefore put Russia at risk and its facilities. But are we where we need to be? For example, in Britain, we're not. Our army is in a tragic state, and our navy is truly in a state of disrepair. Not only do we have only a few ships available at any one time, maybe two if you're lucky out of the Type 45 destroyers of 6, of 7, Type 23s built with thin steel and just not very healthy. You're lucky to get 2 or 3. You're lucky to get a submarine. It's really alarming how our Navy has just degenerated. The RFA that support those ships, the crews oscillate between different ships because they don't pay their crews enough to have enough crews for all the ships. That's never happened in the history of the RFA. So the Air Force has a reasonable number of aeroplanes, but the number of serviceable planes that are on point is really small. And the Army is small too. So no, we're not prepared. The MOD is not fit for purpose. It's a peacetime structure and moribund. The weapon systems, the key people that operate them, we should be really proud of. They're doing the best they can with really appalling circumstances, having run our defences down. And yes, the Conservatives are guilty because they failed to do anything about it, but Labour are truly guilty because they've been in office for a year when it's clearly we're at war with Russia, and they've just put the whole thing down the road by saying we'll increase defence spending in 2 years' time, as if our enemies will just wait for us to do it. And even then, it's a slow burn. So there is total negligence with respect to defence in Britain, more than any other country I can think of. The French, the Germans are rearming, the frontier countries in the East are rearming, the Spanish are probably not on the side. But basically, Britain, it is disgusting, and everyone should be up in arms at how vulnerable we are. If we come under missile attack, I think one of the problems is the sheer drones, which are now being launched in their thousands a night against Ukraine, have produced a multiplicity of large-scale factories. And those drones could be retargeted against Britain, and we would really, really struggle to stop it. On top of the exquisite weapons that we launched from Russian submarines from an Atlantic that we don't protect any more effectively with our Navy, we have real vulnerabilities in Britain, and yet Russia views us as the backbone of NATO, having supported Ukraine in the initial stages and kept it alive. So it's a bizarre circumstance where our leadership has failed to recognize the threat, the direct threat from Russia, and actually just ignored. And what's crazy about it is I could create an alternative scenario where we didn't give things to Ukraine. We created Lend-Lease, as America did to us in the Second World War. We used that Lend-Lease to refuel and restart our defense industry. And then we had real economy and real productivity, which is what everyone really wants. but they've missed the opportunity without the foresight, because somehow war and weapons are dirty, even when you need them to defend yourself. So we've been totally let down by the Labour Party in an epic way. Although I really like John Healey as a head of the MOD for a Labour minister, he has still failed, as certainly Starmer has. And for example, the National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell, who is now caught up in this Chinese spying crisis. And the idea of having a diplomat as a national security advisor who specializes in peace and appeasement at a time when you need to have strong and kinetic capabilities at the first to be strong and defend yourself is truly another really a big wrong by the Labour Party.
So whilst we're on this subject of the UK at the moment, what's your economic view? And then we'll go on reverting back to the Russian situation.
So in terms of my sort of empire structuring models, that we restarted our cycle in the late 70s with Margaret Thatcher. And
okay, I tell you what, let's explain to our viewers what that model is in a kind of like in a nutshell, because this is a fascinating model. It's really worth understanding because you'll really understand what's going on in the world in all the different theaters and all the different nations as well. So yeah, give us the background. Tell us where we are then with the UK.
So it's basically a 5-stage model where if you imagine a Gaussian curve that goes up and round, the first stage is regionalization, and regionalization is usually driven by a population expansion of some kind, and that forces the human system to self-organize. And it reaches a point where its leadership is what I would describe linear versus lateral. It thinks along railway tracks. It doesn't think in strategy. It just thinks about life as a series of railway tracks. But that's not how we expand. Expansive systems are lateral. They break the railway tracks and spill out and go around the sides. And so what happens is you have a regional civil war, in effect, like the English Civil War or the American Civil War. And in that process, the lateralizing agent, the one that wants a newer version, wins. You think about the Cromwellians and the Roundheads, they were far more adaptable as Protestants than the Catholic world, which is quite fixed. If you think about the North, it wasn't about slavery. It was actually about an industrialized society with a freer society compared to a Southern society that was an aristocracy with, the landowners owning most of it. So there was much more to this. And the reason why they could think about releasing slaves is because they were an industrial power. An industry had replaced the human battery because all systems need human or energy to create the anti-entropy to make them work. So that war takes place. The lateralizing agent comes out of it. It's now militarized. They've got rid of the linear people because they didn't survive combat because it's highly adaptive. So the society is lateralized and it expands and it runs down its resource chains. It takes over its neighbors and it expands like algorithmically. Because I take you, then I add you to my resources. I take my neighbor in half the time. I add him to my resources, and you literally accelerate. And that's why they constantly catch people with their pants down. And a good example is how many people in 2002 thought China would equal America 20 years later. Not one you would meet in public could envisage that. How could this emerging market country match the great superpower of the world? Because of this algorithmic expansion, in effect. And then they expand using military USPs with lateral thought processes, great generalship, reaches a point where it can't expand anymore, and there's a point of maturity. Maturity is about integration. And at the top of that curve, as maturity takes place, you see the big institutions of empire appear. So all the great buildings, if you go around London, they're the institutions of empire that enshrine the greatness of the system in architecture. And in that process, suddenly there are bigger systems, and linear people are very good politicians because they're people orientated, whereas lateral people tend to just be mission driven and less sensitive to people's sensitivities if they disagree. And so politics overtakes this creative aspect. And at the top, there's also a sort of civil war of some kind, where basically the lateral agencies lose to the linear agencies, and it becomes a more linear system. But it's huge. It's a dominant system. So it's a big, like, monster traveling in a certain direction. And from that point onwards, it's lessening its adaptation capabilities. As it throws more and more lateral people out and more linear people take control, it becomes more rigid and less adaptive. And that's great because if it's the bigger system around, it can still survive. But as it starts to move to overextension, the cracks start to appear. And then there's a thing like 9/11, which is really fundamentally a change agent and accelerating it into decline. And decline is usually governed by superlinearity, especially if you get money printing. Because what money printing does is it perpetuates bad habits. If you're a CEO of a company and its growth goes from 6% a year to 4%, and you go, well, and you add leverage, you can make it look like it's 6%. And then it happens again, and you add leverage from 4 real, and you've gone to 2, but you add even more leverage, and you still look like you're producing 6% because you've used leverage. So the same poor business practices or leadership practice persist, and the whole system becomes unbelievably rigid. And the people that are screaming, "We've got a problem, Houston," are ejected and they're left in the fields looking at their navels. And that really sums up our Western world, is the adapters, on the whole, have been ejected from the system. And as a result of that, we are non-adaptive, facing a very adaptive China.
So, with having you having just explained the model, let's put the United States, Britain, and China on the various points of that model, and so people understand where we're at.
So moving up the curve and where we are, Britain is actually struggling out of its war of regionalization. The Brexit debate was our civil war of this new cycle. And what's interesting about it, think about how friends fell out. It was really emotive. It was really strong. And what was different about it was that it was constrained by the legal system, that we tried to do it legally within the parliamentary system. And so it was quite unique within human history, because at that stage, normally you get your pikes out and start shooting each other until one side wins. But we didn't. We tried to do it in a constrained way. And it resulted in that moment where Boris, a very lateral prime minister, I would say without linear discipline, which is critical in a combination to really work, came to power and was ready just before the pandemic arrived. At that stage, you could say that our war had been won. The lateral change agents were about to do their business, remove the blob, adapt government, and be a more expansive global Britain. But we were hit by a pandemic. And I argue that pandemic was not an accident, but it was particularly damaging to Britain because it prevented those lateralizing energies from manifesting. And Truss was the accumulation of that. And when Liz Truss came along, she had the right ideas, I would argue, but they were so poorly executed. And she did it just at the time the dollar was at the peak, that her enemies called the dollar peak a sterling crisis. And then lo and behold, luckily, thanks to the Bank of England, who failed to manage risk in the gilt market, we had an overblow of gilts, but that was Truss's fault too. And in a beautiful way, everyone that didn't want adaptive lateral strategies of wealth creation and smaller government that Truss represented could turn around and say, "You're an idiot." But she wasn't. Well, she was, because she didn't execute it properly, but her ideas were correct. And then we swung into this linear Sunak paradigm. So in effect, they swung back. And unlike a war where you kill your linear people and they don't get up, the problem with a nice peaceful version of it is actually they just pick themselves up after hiding in the bushes and come out and just club for the change, not respecting how the electorate basically demanded change. So, and that's one of the reasons why they're morally bankrupt, the Conservative Party, because they ignored what was happening. So that's a really important part. And then if you go and look at the other side of it, that puts Britain just after regionalization. And China is well and truly into expansion. It's basically, so I'm looking out the window, some very big waves coming onto my beach. I've never seen those before. Because sometimes you get small earthquakes around here and they produce teeny little tsunamis. So it looks a bit.
But actually, it's funny you should mention that. I think, well, we won't say where, but David's just off the Mediterranean at the moment, and there has been a bit of seismic activity there just based on cycles. So let us know you're okay there.
Oh, yeah, just one second. That's genuinely a strange wave pattern as someone that's into wave patterns.
Yes, yeah.
Anyway, so that's Britain, and Britain is now, not only did we go back to a linear Sunak, we then, as we tried to basically move to the right of politics, which every country is doing, and because the best way I can describe I think there's a pulse that runs through societies, and the Kondratieff wave was the first inkling for me that it existed, 54 to 56 years. And you saw inflation spikes and you saw conflict correlations. But I've now framed that as actually some form of entropic mechanism that pulses through society. And we build human societies because they're anti-entropic. We live in an entropy-governed universe. And for us to survive, we've got to push the bubble out. So we create social coherence, self-organization, and that's the driver behind how we build empires. It's anti-entropic behavior. And that anti-entropic behavior is predominantly driven by lateral thought processes because they're adaptable and you constantly have to keep pushing. You can never rest, otherwise the bubble suffocates you. And that's an image which, since I've developed this theory 3 or 4 years ago, has just changed my life. For example, we have to keep working because, and if we stop and we have a holiday, we know the bubble's going to come down and collapse us. So we get little pauses, but the truth is the bubble's always there. And that's the same for super systems and empires. It's always under the compression of an entropic bubble. So, and then we have the Labour Party. And the Labour Party came, as we know, because the right was split.
Yeah.
They are not, and this is so interesting, they are not the right party for this time. Because as the entropy increases into the peak of 2030, which is this next cycle peak of what I would call a 112-year war cycle, everything should swing to the right. Everything should be far more adaptive, nationalistic, and less big government, and very opposite of a neo-Marxist Labour Party. And they're in by accident. So every policy that they basically conduct, and they look like they're the accidental idiots, but I don't think they are. I think they have a consistently destructive mindset, which is consistent with neo-Marxism, the idea that you destroy and bring level society down. Look at public schools. Well, that was a great idea. Suddenly, you lose an educational base, and actually it costs more because those people come to your schools, the state schools, and you've got to pay them. And no, you don't get any spare teachers as a result. We all knew it was rubbish, but they sold it that way because they want to level society in their own minds. It's a very destructive mindset. And if you add that destruction onto increased entropy cycles, you're going to double the destruction because you're not in a space where the system can survive. So I think they're very incompetent and their policies mismatch where we are, and they will not make the end term. And I think the spying crisis is a really big deal. For me, there's clear evidence that there are parts of the government that have been infiltrated by the Chinese. The Treasury, for example, who've had this orthodoxy to be pro-Chinese, and they constantly push back against the security concerns of the intelligence services. And I mean, it's just incredible how consistently they've done that. And in even the Conservative government they were doing have incredible power, Andy, and it's just scary. And then if you go and look at having a national security advisor who's basically a peacenik and a peacer, as at a time when you need kinetic defenses, who's got some very strange relationships with MSM, the Chinese security services, close links entities. I think we've been infiltrated, and we really have to consider it most seriously that this government is not acting as an agency for the British people, but has a completely different agenda and has been pulled from Beijing. And I think we need some really very, very incisive public inquiries that go right to the top of the government right now. So that leads us through to where China is. China is well and truly in the
before we get onto China, within your model, one of the things we're seeing is that there seems to be a loss of freedom of speech here at the moment to some extent, but also I see in America, Hegseth and Trump are trying to control who says what coming out of the Pentagon, and suddenly a lot of press agencies are moving away. So there's an argument that contradicts the First Amendment. So let's just have a comment on this idea of suppression of information through the press, or suppression of the press, and that's something that also happened back in 1933 as well. And then let's go on to America in the model as well.
So it's a great call, Andy, because it is bizarre that you've got a party on the left in the UK and a party on the right in the US, and both are suppressing free speech. And America has the audacity to say, you guys over there, you're suppressing free speech, and Trump's leading the charge. And it's like the world's gone mad. The best way to frame it, though, is that we are in this 108, 112-year entropic pulse, which is a double K-wave cycle of a bigger magnitude, which dates back to the 1914 peak or entry point of war, which peaked in 1920. So these wars are triggered before the peak because entropy builds in the system. Imagine the pulse is building and building, and it triggers conflict before the pulse actually reaches its peak. And once it's triggered the cult, that's it. It's like the starting gun on some long distance race. You can't tell how long it takes for the new hegemon to rise. It can be, for example, in the Napoleonic Wars, it was 1792 all the way through to 1815 with a couple of small pauses. In the First and Second World War, it really was 1914 to 1945 with a pause in between. We are in that pulse. We are in the starting gun from 2022 with the invasion of Ukraine. But what that pulse does is it moves everything to the right. And so it destroys individual freedoms and it basically moves it to a point of suppression. And that's why we're seeing this movement, much as it's framed by Labour's left values or Trump's right values. It's a fundamental shift away from freedoms as we move into this conflict dynamic and dictatorship or benevolent dictatorship or centralized control. So it's entirely consistent with that pattern.
Wow. So, um, what other countries do we want to put onto your model before we move ahead
Okay,
with
so
another
so
set of
so
questions?
let's go to where China is. We talked a bit
Yeah.
about it. China is it's really quite exceptional. If you look at history, you see countries and dictators or leaders come forwards and they say, okay, let's go to war, and they plan and they look at the Nazis, 33 to 39, 6 years from arrival to off we go, elbows out. And you look at, I would say, probably the Second Reich, as in Germany, they planned for a lot longer. They planned probably from 1906, so they had 10 years to plan and run up. When the Entente Cordiale really formed against them with Britain and France, that was essentially when people realized what they represented, the expansion of Bismarck's blood and iron vision. It didn't have to be Brain of Britain because of all countries you've ever seen, the Prussian state was born in iron and conflict and melded together by new military science that took the Austrians in 1866 and then clubbed the French in the 1870s Franco-Prussian War. So there was a pause between that and essentially the First World War. But their nature was military, expansive. That Prussian concept goes back to Frederick the Great, when they basically had an army that needed the state because he made it so big, and it was a European joke. So in the process, the Chinese have done something completely different. They've been planning this since 1996, 30 years of planning to overcome American hegemony. And they have done so many things meticulously. Look at the rare earth process. They didn't just suddenly announce it. They had like a year where they were making certain processes where they, first of all, tracked down the supply chains and who used it where. And then they showed they could do it and took it off again. So they've been playing with this tool and we should have known it was there. And our mitigation strategies, I think, have been incredibly slow in the West, considering the severity of what this represents as a choke point. So the Chinese are ready to go, and they are now in a state, and all empires are like this when they're about to expand. Imagine someone who's running, but they're just tripping over. So you start to trip, you sort of imagine an athlete, and you try and keep running further forwards, or you faceplant. That's where China is. And it will only have one solution, and that is some kind of kinetic war, which it seeks to pursue because whether people like it or not, all systems believe and like to expand to the limits of their parameters, and the Chinese want to dominate the world. And they built a system to dominate the world. After all, they control a population of 1.2 billion. They have social engineering to control that population. They've suppressed the Uyghurs, suppressed the Hong Kong population. They know how to take hostile populations, take out the individuals, and everyone else becomes the wheat in the wind. So they are a very serious threat to us. And now if you go to the other side of the world,
Before we do that, just let me, for the viewers that follow my work, which is the mathematical patterns, we are also in the 100-year cycle from the Long March. So this is a clear tipping point or turning point for China. Yeah, but back to you there, David.
and what you say is very interesting because the cycles are behind China if you apply this empire cycle. It started with the Boxer Revolution, and
Yep.
then they moved to their civil war. And the civil war was interesting because the nationalists, the Kumito, or basically the communists, to the outside world, they're both hierarchical. So it wasn't as if one represented a different organizational structure for the other, but they were different. They fought, the communists won. And for that peace after 49 until 1975, they fought every neighbor they could. So the idea that they're a peaceful agency, I'm sorry, you just need to read your history books. And the only reason they stopped in 75 is the Vietnamese gave them a bloody nose, and the American power in the region started to become stronger as they started to win the Cold War. And then they had a glass ceiling above their heads. So I think you're exactly right in these cycles and how they repeat. And I love your work, by the way. I've got to say, I'm a huge admirer of your work. I think
Thank you.
your timing tools are brilliant in terms of where things go and the timing of them. I've followed them for years. I am a huge fan, and anyone who doesn't follow your work, I think, is really missing a point.
Well, thank you. So, I mean, we're certainly here, we're putting two and two together, and I think we're getting some tremendous synergy here. But I just wanted to put that point in. But let's revert back. I think you were just about to discuss China and the model of yours. Yeah. So
Well, I mean, China is at that point of is about to make its next leap, and it's a kinetic leap. It's make no mistake about it that war that they've material war, cyber war, you name it, every version of it they've conducted upon us, and they've got proxy war with the Russians at us, and of course that war is allowing them, like the Spanish War, to learn massive lessons essentially from war and adapt. And when they take those lessons and adapt, they go to the dark fifth generation factories and produce tens of thousands of the new weapon system. Whereas in the West, we sort of look and have a cup of coffee, have breakfast, think about it. A couple of years later, someone has a plan, and 4 years later, maybe it's out. And that adaptive cycle and that adaptive loop is going to kill us because, as the Ukrainians have found, they're more innovative than the Russians. They produce new innovations which give them like tactical advantages in spaces in the battlefield, but they cannot do it on scale enough to prosecute victory. The Russians then adopt that strategy. They then produce it at scale and throw it back at the Ukrainians with terrible consequences. And I think that little paradigm in the Ukrainian front lines is the paradigm we face in the West at the moment. We're going to have the same experience. Great idea, works for a while, not decisive. Oh shit, it's coming over our heads. We're all ducking.
right, right. So is this a good time now to talk about Russia and Ukraine, or do you want to
Yeah,
talk further?
absolutely. Well, as we're
Yeah,
moving through the arc, I think
yeah,
I think it's worth framing where Russia was when it started its war. And Russia, if you look at its pure empire dynamics, is super fraught, as the South Africans would say. And it's because it just didn't have a population that had the worst demographics. So what was it in terms of organizational energy that allowed Russia to go to war? It's the simple answer is Russia is like demographically at the bottom of its cycle, unable to rejuvenate its population. But its actual energy came through a Kondratieff cycle of being a commodity producer. So you think about when the USSR was most powerful, it was 75 into the peak of the commodity cycle. It was producing commodities. Inflation didn't touch it in terms of how its economy worked. And the consumer society of the West was just really gulping every single moment with, 16% CPI and 16% 10-year rates and 23% Fed funds. We barely survived, even though America was actually at the peak of its empire power, that phase of inflation. So that's exactly what Putin's regime represents. He came into power at the bottom of the new cycle in 2002. And at that time, he really thought the only way Russia could survive was integrating into the EU. And much as he tried to do it, he was never allowed to do it. But between '02 and '08, the first surges of commodities happened and wealth flowed into Russia. And so he realized he didn't need the EU anymore, which is why his first speeches of belligerence came about in 2007 and then increasing in 2008. And then 2010, there was a huge oil price spike. And on 2011, he must have felt a bit sick when it dipped and thought, have I been prematurely aggressive? But it recovered. And more importantly, it went sideways above 120. And that was when revenues flowed into the Russian coffers. And as they flowed in, the new armaments programs for these special weapons he created, designed to give him strategic parity where he could in the West and his confidence. And so we only had one chance, and that was 18 and 19 and 20 when oil prices were in the counter-inflationary B wave of the Kondratieff cycle, could we have gone to him and said, Mr. Putin, like, we would like you to join us because you can join the Chinese, but really, if you win the world war with the Chinese, how long will you remain independent? If you come with us, we will surround the Chinese, and he would have been vulnerable because of revenue flows. But if we didn't do it before the price dipped to negative oil, after that, he was untouchable. And that was when we had to brace for conflict. And it was that understanding of the psychology of revenues, the Kondratieff cycle, its impact on Russia, and Putin's own cycle that was, we both predicted the invasion very accurately. But it was, for me, that was the formative structure that created the groundwork that war was inevitable because he was in a particular mindset and feeling very belligerent.
yeah. And just whilst we're on that note, just again for the cycles people, the 2010 oil high was a direct result of the 90-year cycle from the 1920 commodities boom and oil really spiked there, and the 2008 one was a direct relationship to the 144-year cycle going back to the Civil War and the commodity boom there. So just throwing that in again for my people there. But coming back then, so do you think this war in Ukraine really it's in NATO's interest to keep it going, to keep Putin distracted, do you think? Or where do you see this ending up? That's to stop him
Well,
opening up further aggression, say, towards the Scandinavian countries where we are seeing
well,
build-up of troops and strange drone activity and so on.
So let's look at Putin's mindset. Putin didn't go into Ukraine thinking, I just want Ukraine. He
Yeah,
wants the whole of the empire of the USSR back. I think we can accept that. We can see it because of his military strategy. He has a wartime economy, and there's no way you can get a wartime economy to be a peacetime economy because everyone's enfranchised in the weapons of war. So the system is now orientated to long-term war, which is matching his goals. So we face in NATO not just a threat over Ukraine. If Ukraine folds, he'll just come forwards and we're in trouble. Our responses have been slow in NATO, weak, if I might say so. And only recently, with this escalation, when he came back from the parade in Beijing, and he said, "I'm at war with NATO. We're at war," and then these incursions started. The very lamentable response to these incursions, and that's partly because the air defense network in the east of Europe is not coordinated. You'd think it's coordinated, but each country has their own individual rules of engagement, their own crossovers. Instead of saying one NATO front, one engagement, you come near me, we'll shoot you down. And I actually think he provided an opportunity we'd missed. And we should have basically said, we're going to put an air exclusion zone over half of Ukraine to the Dnipro River. That exclusion zone means nothing is going to get through. So that's great for Ukraine because all their war industry will be safe, their people will be safe behind the line. And then you say to Putin, every time you do something that's aggressive, we'll go 100 miles east. And we will only stop when we reach the original borders before 2022, at which stage the front lines will be under our umbrella and you will not be able to survive. And I would do that. And it's within the technology of Western air power because fifth generation jets wipe out any air defense system, as we've seen with the IDF, because you can't see them before the anti-radiation missiles are launched. And it's the greatest strength that NATO has, our air power. And that's what we have to do to force him back. I think the issue of Tomahawks, where Trump is trying to pressurize him with Tomahawks, is actually more dangerous than having an air exclusion zone. Because an air exclusion zone is passive. It sits there and says you can't come into it, but we're
yeah.
not doing you harm. Tomahawks have a psychological impact on Russians, which is really serious. If you're being tomahawked and you're Russian, you are at war with America. So the escalatory process is far greater, and especially when you realize that all the targeting data is coming from America too. I mean, we've been giving NATO targeting data into Ukraine since the World Dot. The Chinese give their targeting data to the Russians. It is a proper world war in a microcosm. There
Yeah.
is no proxy dynamic about it, apart from it's contained to a certain space. And even that containment is grey with the shadow war, which has gone after subsea cables. It's set fire to the Furnace submarine factory, our power stations. It's thrown people off balconies. I mean, he's been enacting a war that in the Cold War, we would have all said, we're at war with you. You can't do that. And because the West is so weak, it just constantly finds excuses not to push back, scared of basically escalation. But in fact, escalation is inevitable unless you do push back, like a bully on a playground.
Wow. So, let's pivot the conversation with this as a tremendous background to this idea of BRICS. First of all, the economic synergies that may or may not exist with BRICS, the threat to the dollar, and where you see this all heading. And a lot of people have jumped. Well, a lot of countries have joined BRICS in the last 2, 3 years. It's expanding rapidly. What's going on here, in your opinion, David?
Well, look, I think we think about BRICS as the emerging market world.
Yeah.
And China is no longer in the emerging market, it's emerged. And India is emerging. So countries are coming out of the old emerging market paradigm. And what is interesting is that, first of all, we've got to look at what the Empire of America was. Because I say was because it isn't the Empire of America as it was, it's in terminal decline. It involved a massive envelope of defense, and it incorporated alliance structures in the Pacific and Europe to strengthen that envelope. And trust and belief between alliance members and towards America as the defender of last resort was integral to that process. Within that envelope, there was a dollarization envelope where the dollar was used within people within the envelope and outside it, but especially within it. And therefore, massive dollarization could be returned with all its advantages to the core of the Empire America, which allowed them to have massive debt and do things with their economy no one else could do. Now, what has Trump done when he's come? The first thing he did was destroy the fabric of that alliance. He destroyed that "I'm going to be there for you" moment, and he destroyed the fracturing, the joints between the alliances. So this whole alliance structure lurched inwards and effectively shrunk metaphorically, and with it, the dollar footprint. Now, what's really clear about all, like if you get a young business, it has big margins and it matures, its margins slow down and it's bigger in scale. But when you get a really big old business, it has massive scale and piss poor margins. So essentially, the moment you lose a bit of margin, you're in the negative. And that's how you've got to think of a mature empire when its dollarized footprint moves a fraction inwards and the dome decreases in volume. It may look like a little bit, but on the margin, it destroys any margin success. And that's what Trump did. Instead of making America great, his first points were to make it weaker because he never understood what the basic structure and fabric of the American empire was or is. So the dollar is definitely shrinking, and because of the amount of debt, it's not a good asset to have. But where do you go? If you go to Japan, basically you're on the borders of the next war, and Japan are very close to China, so that has some problems. If you go to Europe, up until now, Europe has been a very moribund area, but it is changing. And I think that change has come by the fact it's bonded by a common enemy called Russia. And Germany, at the middle of it, has got a leader for the first time that's not under Russian control. Because if you go back to Schroeder, Merkel, Olaf, and now you go to this current leader, he is definitely not under Putin's control as they drive towards rearmament and use a 64% debt to GDP ratio to not only drive Germany, but drive the whole of Europe. So there's a reformation going on, and it's about the energy of rearmament. So all of those things coming together, the dollar's in decline. So what about BRICS? Well, one of the things that we've seen is the flows of capital to the emerging market world out of America and the West have gradually been drying up. And for a long time, China was far more willing to fill that gap. It's not doing it now. And I could draw you a map. So, for example, its map now stops because it thinks when I go to war, I will not control the seas outside the third island chain, so I cannot benefit from my investments, which is why investments in Africa have really tailed off with the Chinese. And what they're left with is all sorts of insurgent agencies, which I think are there to deny Africa to the West. So you see there's an awful lot of armed elements that shouldn't be there. There's 4 million Chinese of military age. There's, like terrorist organizations being trained in the Cape Flats in Cape Town. All over the place, Africa, I can see these denial cells. So the Chinese strategy, which is now changing again the BRICS dynamic, is one of what does my war look like? In the early stages, if I'm successful, I eject America from the third island chain, but I don't have enough ships to go to the blue oceans. So Africa's a non-accessible resource basin, and so is Latin America, which basically I'm just going to make so difficult to manage that I'll make it contested, and therefore my enemies can't get the resources. But basically, the other part of it is that when you're a small power, and if you just go and look at Indonesia as a really good example, Indonesia has switched to the shadow of the Chinese power base. It's strategic for them because they don't have to fight over it. It's highly populous, so that would be troublesome, which leaves just the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, and Japan and South Korea. So there are less countries to flip. And even recently, China's been operating with Malaysia. So the Malacca Straits are available. So as I start to talk about this, you can see going around the place,
Yeah.
you can see what's happening. You can see that countries that are in the future economic zone of influence are flipping towards China, and military aid follows, or military neutrality is part of the condition. And the areas further out may think, for example, in Latin America, like Brazil, they've got their elbows out. But the truth is, they're in the American sphere of influence. So when the whole conflict happens, it'll just snap and it'll split into proper global bifurcation. And I think the rare earth thing on Friday was an acceleration of the bifurcation because Trump will keep his trade tariffs up because it's all he can do. He's impotent. And that will only increase as this tension runs along its course.
Well, I'll just come in there again from a cycles viewpoint. If the 90-year cycle is dominant in many ways. Half of that is 45 years. Multiply by that by 3. That takes us back to the 1890s, where America had substantial tariffs, and in fact, all it did was really create massive inflation and a lack of product availability. Tractors went up sixfold, and in fact, that administration lost the midterms and also spawned the Populist Party because the farmers had had enough of it all. So it was very much an own goal back then. And I'm just wondering what your views are, where America's going to end up with all these tariffs.
Well, I think you've described it really well, and it's a good example of how all of us need to be respectful of the lessons of history. Is that it's very clear that tariffs are highly inflationary, and the people that pay the price are the population. So, I don't understand how Trump can think it's beautiful, apart from money flows into the US Treasury, which prevents the bond crisis because it looks like their revenues are increased. That's the only thing I can think of, for America that's a good part of it. But the substitution and adaptation through industry won't take place for 10 years. So this inflation level will stay with us. And we're already in a phase when we can expect super commodity inflation coming on down the track, an acceleration of an underlying inflation, and it will be a burden that just will not, America can't tolerate. Which is why he's trying to get control of the National Guard and the military, because he wants to ensure he is King Trump. And he realizes there will be a lot of bumps along the way, because anyone that studied a history book understands inflation comes with tariffs, especially as extreme as these. So he's not stupid in that respect. And I think his grab for the military is because he does want them to be loyal, not to the Constitution, but himself. He is seeking dictatorship. And it was one of the warnings I made 2 years ago when Trump was on the horizon and said, this time round, he will create a dictatorship. And I created a model which, I know it sounds unpalatable at the time, but actually I think Project 2025 is modeled off how the Nazi Party took control of Germany. And you only have to look at the historical parallels to really see each step of 2025's project in the States matches what the Nazi Party have done. Even the types of people that actually Hitler brought towards him, or, somewhat extreme characters who were failed in other walks of life. They weren't great successes. Well, you can see that parallel in many of the MAGA members, with the exception of Marco Rubio, who I think is really, really great. Actually, I think he's a super member of the leadership.
So, I mean, yeah, I mean, the 90-year overlay is something I look at continuously. So it's interesting you point that out there. Where do you see this all heading then? I mean, do you think the Trump is going to remain in power? I was talking to another expert whom I was with a couple of weeks ago, who is convinced that Trump is going to bring in military law effectively to override the Constitution and retain continuous power. But having
Yeah, I
said that,
think
his age is
I, I,
also.
I would agree with him. I mean, it's very clear that Project 2025 is the overturning of the American Republic. And, just a little fact that he wants to be on a dollar coin next year. If you look at the history of coins with leaders from the migration of, in effect, republics to dictatorships or empires, it's really very highly correlated. And now you're talking about Trump on a dollar coin, not a coincidence. I think that the battle in the courts between the states over the National Guard is really massive. And there's only two bastions that preserve the Constitution at the moment. There's a Supreme Court, which is of questionable independence. And we'll see on November the 4th how they fare over the tariff judgment. And then there's the military. And interesting enough, when Hitler went to go and persuade the Prussian-dominated German military, he approached it in a very similar way, slowly eroding them, slowly moving through them. And what's most alarming is the way that anyone, first of all, that Trump took the intelligence agencies, highly capable agencies, where individuals at the top of the tree were removed just because they might not have been loyal to Trump versus the Constitution. And at the same time, replace them with very incompetent people. So the intelligence that's coming out of the system is degraded. It's happening in the military. And you can see that constant process with Hexas changing people. And the 800 strong meeting was really part of that process. Its singular message was, you come when I tell you, like, you should listen to me. And they met him and they stonewalled him. So the implication is there's going to be a battle. There's going to be a battle between the military and Trump over the Constitution. Now, the only question is does that battle take place? And then as it's taking place, the Chinese take advantage of it? Or do the Chinese strike first and therefore there's unity in America to face a common enemy? Those are the only parameters that I think are variable. But yes, conflict for America, whether internal, external, or combination, is now inevitable, in my opinion.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Wow. So we've talked about, I'm just looking at my list of questions
What do
here.
you what do you what do you think? about this
What,
particular topic.
what do I think in
Yeah.
terms of cycles? This is your show, David, where we're interviewing you.
No,
But
no, no. This is this is
um,
this is this is us speaking.
so yeah, so here's what I think. Then, if you're asking, there's a 250-year cycle in empires, and basically, if we take 1776, add 250 years, that takes us to 2026. It's death and rebirth or all change. So my first view was that America has been in the process of change. Now, if you've got a 250-year cycle, it plays out over 20 years, 10 years either side. What did we see? We saw this new presidency in 2016, and pretty much 10 years exactly, right? We saw the world change. It went from globalization to polarization. We saw Brexit. We saw the arrival of a different type of presidency in the form of Donald Trump. And we saw this complete change. And that also tied in with the modern day revolution cycles that I talk about. So that time period there took us back to the rise of Hitler in 1932. That took us back to the previous revolution, or the previous cycle took us back to 1848 with the arrival of Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, and workers rise up, break free of your chains. And then the previous repetition there exactly to the Stamp Act. So it's revolutions combining with mass change. And if you take this 250 years and double it up, that takes us to the Reformation, where the Catholic Church is challenged as well. So all this is coming into play. But if we're saying what exactly do we see happening next with America? Well, it's in a point of tremendous change. The American Revolution and everything that it stood for is about to be undone or changed in some sort of huge way. And the other side of this that I was thinking more recently about was there were two parts, as there have to be two parties to all these events. So Great Britain, or the United Great Britain from 1707, United Kingdom from 1801, is also on the receiving end of this 250-year cycle with regards to America and America's dominance. So it's all change, and let's face it, you and I are off the generation where we've had a pretty good 30, 40 years, generally speaking, but I don't feel so optimistic for our kids, really, is how I'd see this. And then what I would also say is that the 100-year cycle from the 1929 crash plays out in 2029, the 90-year cycle from the outbreak of 1939, and the Second World War plays out in 2029. So we're only 4 years away from that point. I really think that everything is destabilizing. I think the equity markets could head up higher if we're going to look at the 90-year pattern of, the 100-year pattern there of what happened in the equity markets. But it's not very stable at the moment. That's all, and I think that we could really see civil war in a different form that we've seen civil wars in previously, but about it's civil war between belief systems. These civil war cycles for America I've been talking about for a while, and they're already coming in. They are going to peak. There's going to be a secondary peak in Q3, I think Q4 of 2027. So that blue versus red, but there's a lot of water to go under the bridge before that point in time. But let's get back to you. I mean, that's what I think.
But then we have very similar minds about what we're
Yeah,
seeing. Very similar.
yeah,
And the profoundness of this change. And I think you touched on something that's really, it's certainly driven me, is that when I started to put all this together back in 2002, speak to people, and my second and third child arrived, I felt a real drive that this knowledge I'd uncovered and its conclusion into World
yeah,
War III, that's 20 years ago, had to be explained to people to avoid it. So I thought that by standing up and speaking and writing Breaking the Code of History and other books that I've written about this onset of conflict, by the time we got to the point, we would be in the state of deterrence that we saw in the Cold War. And that maybe we might head it off at the pass and we would see our enemy and we would be doing something about it. In my wildest dreams, I could not have imagined what I now describe as extinction dissonance, this denial of our condition across our society. And I think there are three elements to extinction dissonance. There's one that we saw in evidence in 1914, the collective denial that World War could ever happen because of economic entwinement with Germany, that was our closest ally in Europe up until that moment. And the royal families were entwined. So there was a denial about the possibility that could happen. But we have two other elements, and because we definitely have hegemonic denial in the process today. But the other elements by basically putting all this money in and creating linearity. The warning dogs, the sheepdogs of our society have been ejected. So there are no sheepdogs barking and saying, look what's happening, because they're all the sheep eating the grass and they're leading the show. And the other bit for everyone that's also in the flock is the dopamine that's related to higher stock markets means your cortisol responses don't exist. And therefore you can't see the dangers. So those three elements don't just add up, not additive. I think they multiply into what I call extinction dissonance, because we are not prepared for what's coming. We are truly, if I didn't live in this society and didn't, love it, essentially I would look for on and say that is a soft society that's hubristic and blind, and it deserves to be eradicated and wiped out because it just wasn't sharp enough. And in a Darwinistic world where the strong survive and the weak don't, we weren't strong enough. And my concern for all of our children has really driven me to make this public. And I think we as a generation and the generation below us have totally failed and left them with a nightmare. And we need to be really cognizant of our responsibility. And in that regard, I just don't blame the combatants or the aggressors in the world we see. I actually blame the people that didn't respond because they refused to respond, didn't have the courage to look. They were sheep eating the grass with the wolves and the sheepdogs, one or two barking, but they thought, just one more blade of grass, please. And I think that segment of our society, which is more numerous.
Most people got not most a lot of people have the attention span of a flea right now. That's it. It's terrible. But in the macro world, one of the things of observed, and it ties in with these cycles, is that, and I study a lot of the work of WD Gann. He writes about this as well, and he talks about after three generations. Basically, you don't see big wars that close together. I mean, okay, you could argue that the First World War and the Second World War were fairly close together, but the whole idea is that as you leave a big war like the Second World War, there will be people and politicians and statesmen who will tell you we are not going to war. It is pretty horrible to be. And even when I was at university, the mother of a friend of mine, she was always saying we had to go and hide under the kitchen table. I hope the bombs wouldn't fall on our house or nearby. So they had that memory, and it was those people that would make sure that you didn't go to another war. But after three generations, the remaining people, and we were up at myself and a friend were up to visiting the Chelsea pensioners, the very last few people, who lived through the Second World War. Nobody's listening to them. Nobody alive has had to live through a war, and therefore it's very easy. Gann calls the character the young buck will take you to war. Based on ego. So look, I'm just relaying ideas and thoughts here. But we are at that point where we are more than three generations on from the last big war that saw things hitting us in Britain, for example. America historically has been lucky lucky in as much as it's never had to endure war on its own ground, and therefore it's with two exceptions: Pearl Harbor, which was the 7th of December 1941, and then 9/11, which was 60 years and 3 months. So within the 60-year cycle playing out perfectly, with a tolerance of 3 months. Well, that's nothing. 60 years there on September the 11th, 2001, the only time America's been attacked on its own soil. So we're seeing this. If you've never been attacked on your own soil, it's great to say, yeah, let's go and nuke them. Let's do this, let's do that.
And that's this sort of splendid isolation of America, which is, we're impervious with two oceans on either side. The thing they don't realize is with long-range rocketry, that's all changed. And the Chinese are planning to put hypersonic weapons on DF-41s, which will destroy American carriers on the West Coast naval ports before they even leave. So the war is coming to them for the first time, and those oceans are not able to protect them. So I think you're really right. And in fact, as you talk about that, I thought about a really good example of, the First World War. What happened was Germany didn't really appreciate it that it had lost. I know that sounds crazy, but the generals blamed the politicians. And when the last shot was fired on the 11th of the 11th, that was to the generals at the time a pause before they could start it up again. And it's a little known fact: the Royal Navy put a squeeze on the German economy for 9 months, and something like 450,000, no, it's a bigger number, 450,000 Germans starved in that period before they agreed to peace. but they never had a proper crushed, surrendered moment where they had to accept an occupying force. And then, of course, like they rose up again in 32 under a different leadership. Now, here's an interesting question. Why did Germany behave like that? And my argument using the empire cycles is it was the youngest empire, basically, or empire system or cycle system in Europe, because it came into being, you could argue, after it started with the federation of the Prussian states, and they consolidated in 1866, and then it came into life in 1870. So it was young and had massive demographics. I mean, it had 8 million more people in 39 than it did at the end of 1918. And France still hadn't replaced its population, and Britain was 1 or 2 million more. So it had this demographic energy, and then the energy had to be manifested. So the old regime had failed to expand the system. So the Nazi regime came in, which was a very lateral system from the lower ranks, challenged the old Prussian system, and off they went. So the simple lesson is expanding systems find ways to expand. So if you look at Hamas and you think, is it an expanding system or not? It is, because it's linked to the Islamic world, which also has its own expansion coefficients. So that means you really do have to deal them like ISIS a death before it disappears, because it will resurge and it will malignantly transmit everywhere and metastasize. So that was the First World War. It wasn't completed the armistice prevented the collapse of Germany. And if Germany had basically been invaded, they never would have remembered that. It would be like Japan. It would have a completely different route afterwards. So the trouble is with wars, and when they start, you have to make sure the aggressor can never get up again. It sounds like it's the same to you. You can never let that person come back at you, because they will. And you might not be in a state to protect yourself the second time around.
Yeah. What can we say? So, I've written down here coping with the Cassandra complex, because let's face it, this hasn't been the most cheery conversation, although it's a very reality sort of grounding one. How do you personally cope with all these sort of these dire warnings that are unfolding? Because the cycles are, we have to look back and say, actually, we've had some absolutely golden decades and glorious years in the West. So, the worm is turning, as they say. But how do you personally cope with all this stuff when you see it?
Well, I know this may, sound humorous to those that haven't heard me before, but I'm fundamentally a very optimistic person.
Right.
And I am really, so my part of optimism is understand the problem, solve the problem. So
Right.
the first part of this problem is everyone's asleep as conflict is coming towards us. And our
Right.
chances of survival when we're asleep are zero. So basically, my idea of this communication is, although it comes as a shock and people sometimes don't want to listen or say, no, you're mad, but actually the evidence proves I'm not mad, because we've been predicting it and the trail has worked incredibly precisely over 25 years. So our track record is not one you want to easily
Yeah.
refute or go against. But more importantly, my vision was mobilization, strength, and deterrence.
Mm.
And that was always my mission. The first part was imparting a reality, and the second part of my work is like mitigating strategies, which are all over my work. And what do we do? How do we do it? How do we count with our opposition? What do we do that can bring about the right outcome for us with the minimal casualties? All of those mindsets are actually part of Global Forecaster. So I don't see it as just a communication of bad news and good luck. Over to you, buddy. We're all screwed. I see it as wake
Right.
up and we can do
Right.
something about it.
Yeah.
Now, how does that feel personally? It's a very insightful comment. Um, I'm very lucky because I have a fantastic partner who's actually full of life, and she drags me into the present, and and says, "Hey, we'll have fun here. We have amazing fun." So I have a personal discipline of being
Yeah.
in the present, which is actually a real skill set when your role is to look at the future, because you have to transport your consciousness to a different place to do that and level of awareness. And if you only live in that space as someone that has the ability to see forwards, you'll waste your life, because your life is in the present. So understanding how to move, not just intellectually, but experientially between those phases has been a important part of my journey to make it sustainable. And the other thing is I do truly believe in the individual spirit. I don't think that collective organization, the communist parties of the world or dictators of the world are the best manifestation of humanity. I think individual expansion and potential are remarkable in our race. and that it only might take one or two individuals who break out further than others to drag the whole of their democracy forwards. And it's that we need to support and understand. And so I see hope for the system. Now, the problem is when you look at democracy, we must remember that democracy is in its weakest form after a 500-year empire called the Super Western Christian Empire, which produced Catholic empires and then Protestant empires, then maritime hegemonies and a democracy as a result of maritime hegemonies, and that process of the sea lateralizing through societies and self-responsibility. We are looking at democracy in its weakest form, but actually it can be reborn. But to be reborn, it's going to have to go through the fire. And the question is how that fire plays out. Trump is one element of those flames as to whether America can find its voice democratically. But if you were to go and look at who wins the Third World War, I still favor individuality that comes from the West. But we do have to wake up to scale and the problems. And all of us actually face the threat from AI, because I think the Terminator scenario is a very, very real threat. That through this arms race over the Third World War, we essentially create an agency like an AI into robotic killing systems that can turn on us. And I think that may be the destiny of many sentient races around the universe, because they all get to the same stage at the same time. And strange enough, it'll be arms races that empowers those Terminator systems because we give them the weapons with shorter kill chain cycles. So I think we have a collective enemy that's not just human. I think it's our own aspiration to create another life form that may not and will not see life the way we do, because we live through creative destruction. We destroy things and we create. And one of my most recent theories, which explains everything, a bit like unified field theory, is I kept thinking, why do we organize? Why do we see these patterns? What exactly is the prime driver? And I touched on it earlier. It's this idea of entropy and anti-entropic behavior. Yet what's really interesting is as if the world and universe wasn't entropic enough, humans have this thing that we do, which is create super entropy through conflicts, which creates a response of super adaptation and anti-entropy, which then propels the productiveness of our social systems for the next 70 or 80 years before they become linear, sequestered, and the cycle starts again. So we are using wars to evolve. And the biggest message I have of all of my work is that until we understand how we use wars to evolve through lateralization and anti-entropy, much as we say we don't like them, much as we say we don't want them, we are basically going to keep having them in our society until we destroy ourselves.
Wow. Okay. So actually, a couple of things you mentioned there. AI. So you think that could all be part of the end of us all, or what do you
I
think?
think it's a very real issue right now. When we only see certain applications, but it's very clear that AIs are being used in both sides to gather targeting data and to control weapon systems. And you can say there's a man in the loop, but the person that takes the man out of the loop will have a faster kill chain cycle, the one that keeps it in. And as you're in a war and an arms race, one side will do it over the other. In which case, the machine has uninterrupted interruptions between its consciousness and the activation of weapons. And that's exactly the story of Terminator and
Yeah.
Skynet.
Wow, that's a very sobering thought. So, is there anything else you'd like to add here? There is actually one thing. Sorry, it's that'd be kind of a nice, well, I say not a nice, but a point to stop here. But there are a couple of other things here: Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. What's your view on those?
So I don't think cryptocurrencies are a safe haven. I think that they are a representation of the excess liquidity through money printing. So we've seen in the US stock market the narrowness or the breadth of the market has become narrower and narrower and narrower, and to a few stocks which epitomize the bull market. And strange enough, if you just took the time to look at cryptos, you'd see exactly the same thing. And the FANG in the US is actually paralleled by Bitcoin with greater liquidity, and essentially that I think has peaked. And so,
Right.
we forget Ethereum, we forget you name them, Litecoin. If you look at them, they are just in massive declines and corrective cycles. And yet people tell bull stories, hanging on to the one thing which is just made a high at 125,000 and has dropped. And I think crypto is going to have, there was an awful lot of press over dropping basically from 125 to 105 or whatever in a short period of time with some manipulation. Well, welcome to the crypto world. You're going to go from that number and you get cleaned out. because it's too full of people, and it's not a safe haven, and it's not a new world. I think gold is a safe haven, but gold has surged, and gold has a quality, and silver, which is basically it preempts entropy. So it is not coincident with entropy, it's a warning of oncoming entropy. So one of the things I did last quarter was warn people that gold and silver were really going to super rally, but it would do so in the quiet summer. And essentially, it would do so, and then afterwards, we would see a more entropic leap forwards. And we've seen that with escalation in Ukraine to all-out clear warfare. We've seen that with the rare earth trade competition. So that's the entropy that matches the advanced movement of gold and silver. And funny enough, although you think the world is getting worse, you may be disappointed because, in fact, that is where you may get some profit-taking and corrections. And I think precious metals are actually quite linked to stock markets, because when the stock markets go down, historically, gold and silver have not done very well. So just watch out for the corrections with the coincidence of the two.
Okay, so let's wrap this up then. So the question I get asked all the time is, where do you put your assets? Where do you think the safest places are, and what are the best opportunities? So let me ask you that one.
Well, it's been in precious metals for the past 3 years, and especially the miners,
Okay.
which have been huge and massive returns. I think moving from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy mindset is really the future for investors, and understanding exactly what that means. No handbags and no frilly skirt manufacturers, but things that make propellers for drones, things that are part of a war machine will have value. So I would encourage people to shift to that paradigm and start thinking about a different world. There are lots of studies on my work at different levels. I did this very extensive study on the First and Second World War, how asset classes behaved, where you needed to be, and I linked them into these Kondratieff cycles and these war cycles because actually they create different outcomes. So I have a very, very intricate plan as to how to manage through this. But they are two parts of it that I've shared.
Fantastic. And then if people want to access your information, obviously Breaking the Code of History is a fantastic book. I'm a big fan of it. What else do you have, and where can they find you?
So come to Global Forecaster, www Global Forecaster, or to davidmurrin.co.uk. And on it, you can do a number of things. You can sign up for Murrinations, which are the geopolitical part. They're a pittance. They're like £50 a month. But essentially for that, you're getting investment grade analysis of the geopolitical world. And though it may not say to you buy something, which it doesn't do in that, you can understand how the world works in a completely different way. And the things we've talked about today are covered in extensive detail, and they're all accessible at that level. There's a higher level where we do prediction strings, which are basically day-to-day updates with information there for professional people. And you don't need a newspaper or any other form of news, because we'll tell you the ones that are most important and the things you don't see in the Western world, which link to these scenarios moving forwards. And then we have a whole inside out hedge fund where people can come and be, if you're a professional investor, you can get the CIO's view, which is essentially me as a CIO advising that investor group. And then we have an action strategy with real-time buys and sells, which are tracked. And then we have a consultancy level where we sit alongside people. So it's really for the top end of the investment world. And those people that come as high net worth individuals need to go through a screening to work with me. But happy to do that if you fit into that category, and happy to basically share the ideas. I really, like you, come from a place of wanting to share these ideas, as much as being the person that holds the information and squeezes money out in return. I want transformation in my contact, which is why I built Global Forecaster rather than set up a second hedge fund. It's because I wanted to explain what was happening, because otherwise our children don't have a chance, ultimately.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. It's been an incredibly insightful and enlightening session. And thank you. I just can't thank you enough. I look forward to the next time. So thanks,
Look,
David.
Andy, and I can't thank you. I love your work. And, proper people that understand Gann's work, who's really one of the most insightful investors in history, are rare. And so, I love our conversations, because I didn't get to ask you as many questions as I should do. Perhaps we should do one where I'll interview you, and we'll do it the other way around.
I'd love to. That'd be great. No, that'd be
Because you
fantastic.
really deserve an equal airing, I think, as a great friend of mine and a great practitioner.
Thanks very much.